Dry War Encounters, Jake McNiece. How Jake McNiece used Type 99 Arisaka in 1940 with fearless push to rescue allies. Hidden. The fog came in low over the Belgian farmland, swallowing the burned-out barn where 3 men lay bleeding. November 1940, 18 months before Pearl Harbor, 2 years before Jake McNiece would officially exist in the 101st Airborne's rosters. But on this cold night, hunched behind a collapsed stone wall with mud creeping through his boots, McNiece was very real, and holding a weapon that had no business being in his hands. The Type 99 Arisaka rifle felt wrong. Too long, bolt action stiff with rain. The 7.7mm rounds scavenged from a diplomatic courier ambush 3 weeks prior rattled in his pocket like dice. 11 rounds. McNiece worked the bolt, slick and unfamiliar, and counted again. 11 rounds between him and the barn, 50 yards ahead, where Lieutenant Morris was bleeding through his leg tourniquet and Corporal Vega had stopped answering radio checks. This wasn't supposed to be combat. The mission brief had been clean. Observe German defensive positions along the pre-Siegfried line, map fortifications, report back. US military advisors embedded with British commandos, all off the books, all deniable if captured. McNiece had been recruited for his demolition expertise, someone who could identify structural weak points, someone expendable enough to deny. He'd accepted because the pay covered his mother's farm debt and because sitting out a war that was clearly coming felt like cowardice. Then Morris had insisted on pushing closer to the German radio station. A tripwire, a flare, chaos. Now the MG-42 in the tree line sent bursts across the open ground, methodical and patient. Mortars cratered the mud between McNiece's position and the barn. He could see the doorway, shattered timbers hanging like broken teeth. Inside, Morris, Vega, and a British liaison officer named Whitmore. All trapped, all depending on McNiece to do something monumentally stupid. He checked the Arisaka again. The rifle had been a curiosity when they'd taken it off a dead courier near Antwerp. Some diplomatic mess involving Japanese observers and German intelligence that no one wanted to explain. Now it was the only long-range weapon McNiece had after his Thompson jammed crossing the canal. The sighting was different, the trigger pull heavier. But physics was physics. Breathe, aim, squeeze. The problem wasn't the rifle. The problem was math. 11 rounds. 4 Germans visible in the orchard, unknown numbers in the farmhouse to the east. And the fearless push, the 30 yards of open ground he'd have to cross to reach the barn, looked like a killing corridor designed by someone who hated paratroopers. McNiece had learned demolition math in Oklahoma oil fields. Sometimes you had to move forward into the blast zone because hesitation killed more people than shrapnel. Get close, set the charge, move. Overthinking got you buried under rock and regret. This was the same equation, just wetter. And the Germans had mortars. He sighted down the Arisaka's iron sights, tracking a soldier leaning around an apple tree. His hands trembled. Not from cold, from the certainty that the next 60 seconds would either save 3 men or add his name to the list of ghosts this classified mission would leave behind. In 2 years, he'd be rigging bridges in Normandy. In 3, he'd be a legend. But right now, in November 1940, Jake McNiece was just a stubborn Oklahoma kid with a Japanese rifle and no good options. He fired. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The Arisaka kicked harder than expected. The round punched through bark and cloth. The German dropped. McNiece cycled the bolt, feeling the rifle's rhythm now, adjusting for the slight pull to the left. 10 rounds. The MG-42 swung toward his position. McNiece rolled behind the wall as 7. 92mm rounds chewed through stone, spitting fragments that stung his neck. He came up firing 2 quick shots into the muzzle flash. The machine gun went silent. 8 rounds. Inside the barn, Morris shouted something McNiece couldn't make out over the ringing in his ears. Probably cursing, probably telling him not to be an idiot, but Morris didn't understand the equation. 4 men trapped, 1 man mobile, no backup coming. The joint US-UK intelligence cell that had sent them into Belgium would disavow the entire mission if contacted. This wasn't war. This was a training accident that happened to involve live ammunition and men who would officially never exist. McNiece had 48 hours of memory pressed into his skull, the safe house outside Antwerp, where a British major with cold eyes had outlined their task. Map the German positions, identify weak points in fortifications, don't engage, don't get caught. The major hadn't mentioned what to do when your lieutenant ignored the don't engage part and walked the patrol straight into a German forward observation post. A rifle cracked from the farmhouse. The round sparked off stone 2 inches from McNiece's head. He dropped flat, pressing into mud that smelled like manure and cordite. His mind raced through options, all bad. Option 1, stay pinned, wait for dark, hope the Germans got bored. Outcome, Morris bleeds out, Vega's radio stays dead. Whitmore loses his leg to infection. Option 2, fall back, report the mission compromised, request extraction. Outcome, 3 men die while McNiece explains to some desk officer why he abandoned them. Option 3, the fearless push. Cross 30 yards of open ground under machine gun and rifle fire, reach the barn, improvise an escape with whatever demolition gear survived the drop. Outcome, probable death, possible survival. McNiece had never been good at following orders when the orders were stupid. Back in Oklahoma, foremen hated him because he'd argue about placement of dynamite charges, insisting his way was safer even when theirs was regulation. He'd been fired twice before he was 20, but the bridges he blew stood or fell exactly when they were supposed to, and the men who worked with him went home with all their fingers. This was the same logic. Regulations said, wait for support. Reality said there was no support. His gut said Morris had maybe 20 minutes before shock took him. McNiece rose to a crouch, sighting through the fog. The Germans in the orchard were repositioning, moving to flank. He fired twice more. 1 miss, 1 hit, 6 rounds. Then he made the choice. He broke cover. The fearless push wasn't tactics. It wasn't training. It was pure demolition math. Speed equals survival when the blast zone is collapsing around you. McNiece sprinted straight across the open ground. The Arisaka clutched against his chest, every step expecting the bullet that would drop him. German rifles cracked, rounds whipped past his head. He didn't serpentine, didn't duck, just ran straight, because 30 yards was either 5 seconds of movement or a lifetime of regret, and slowing down meant dying halfway. His boots hit barn wall, his lungs screamed. He collapsed against shattered timber, hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped the rifle. Inside, Morris looked up from his blood-soaked leg, eyes wide. "McNiece, you crazy son of a—" "Save it." McNiece sucked air through his teeth, tasting copper and fear. "Can you move?" Whitmore, pale and trembling against the barn's back wall, gestured weakly toward a gap in the timber. "Drainage ditch, runs east to the canal. But they'll flank us in 2 minutes." McNiece scanned the barn's interior. Hay bales, broken cart, shattered roof beams hanging at angles that made his demolition instincts scream warnings about structural collapse. And in the corner, partially buried under debris, his pack, the one that had torn loose during the canal crossing, the one with the TNT blocks and improvised satchel he'd scrounged from a collapsed Belgian mine. Vega sat slumped against the wall, conscious but grey-faced, whispering prayers in Spanish. His radio lay smashed beside him, victim of the same shrapnel that had opened his shoulder. Morris had his leg elevated on a hay bale, tourniquet cinched tight, trying to stay focused through blood loss and shock. Outside, McNiece could hear German voices coordinating. They knew the barn was a trap now. They'd bring up mortars, collapse it from a distance, or just wait for the Americans to bleed out. McNiece pulled the pack free and assessed his options. 3 blocks of TNT, slightly damp but functional. 1 roll of detonation cord, frayed at both ends. A handful of blasting caps in a cigarette tin, and the knowledge that what he was about to do violated every engineering principle and military regulation he'd ever encountered. "What are you thinking?" Morris asked, voice tight with pain. "Thinking the barn's front wall is load-bearing," McNiece said, running his hands along the support beams. "Thinking if we collapse it right, we buy maybe 90 seconds before they flank through the rubble. Thinking 90 seconds gets us to that ditch. And if the whole structure comes down on us." McNiece met his eyes. "Then we die faster than we would have bleeding here." This was the paradox that would define McNiece's war. The line between courage and recklessness, so thin you couldn't see it until years later, when you were still alive and trying to explain why you'd made the choices you made. In 1940, hunched in a Belgian barn with 3 men depending on his judgment, he wasn't thinking about legend or medals. He was thinking about his mother's farm, about the foreman in Tulsa who'd told him improvisation was just another word for disaster, and about whether Morris had kids back home. He worked fast, packing the TNT against the main support beams, running the detonation cord in a pattern that would direct the collapse outward. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times in oil fields, except oil fields didn't shoot back, and mistakes in Oklahoma meant paperwork, not corpses. A rifle round punched through the barn wall, missing Vega by inches. The Germans were getting closer. 45 seconds after I light this," McNiece said, crimping the blasting cap with hands that barely trembled now. Fear compressed into focus. Terror transformed into the cold clarity that came from being the only person in the room who knew how explosives worked. "Move on my signal, don't stop, don't look back." Whitmore stared at the charges, then at McNiece. "This is insane." "Yeah." McNiece pulled out his lighter, dented steel, a gift from his first demolition crew boss. "But staying here's suicide, and I'm shit at following suicide orders." "Deuce, would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." The fuse hissed to life, a thin line of sparks crawling toward the TNT. 45 seconds. McNiece grabbed Morris under the arms, half dragging him toward the barn's back opening. Vega stumbled upright, using the wall for support. Whitmore limped behind, face twisted with pain and disbelief. 30 seconds. The Germans reached the barn's front entrance. McNiece heard boots on stone, harsh commands in German. Someone shouted about Americans inside. The MG-42 opened up, stitching the barn's facade with rounds that punched through rotten timber like paper. 20 seconds. They moved through the barn's rear gap, stumbling into knee-deep water that smelled like stagnant death. The drainage ditch, half filled with November rain and runoff from the fields. McNiece pushed Morris ahead, then Vega, then Whitmore. The ditch ran east through fog so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. 10 seconds. A German soldier appeared at the barn's back corner, rifle raised. He saw them. His eyes went wide. He started to shout. The TNT detonated. The blast wave hit McNiece like a wall, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into cold water. His ears rang. His vision whited out. When he surfaced, gasping, the barn's front wall had collapsed exactly as calculated, sending timber and stone cascading across the German approach. Dust and smoke rolled through the fog. Screams from somewhere in the rubble, soldiers caught in the collapse, trapped under beams that had stood since before this war started. McNiece didn't look back. Couldn't. His hands found Morris's jacket, hauled him upright. Vega was already moving, terror and adrenaline overriding his wound. Whitmore splashed through the water behind them, cursing in clipped British vowels that would have been funny under different circumstances. They moved through the ditch, freezing water soaking through boots and trousers, the fog swallowing them like a protective shroud. Behind them, German voices shouted in confusion, trying to assess casualties, trying to figure out if the Americans were dead in the rubble or escaped into the night. McNiece's mind catalogued losses as they moved. Thompson jammed and abandoned, Pack buried under barn debris, 3 blocks of TNT spent, and the Arisaka left behind in the chaos, its 8 remaining rounds unfired, the Japanese rifle that had bought them 30 crucial seconds, now lost in Belgian mud. His hands shook, not from cold, from the delayed shock of what he'd just done. The math had worked. The collapse had bought time. But the margin had been thinner than he'd calculated. 5 seconds slower, and they'd have been in the barn when it came down. 3 seconds faster, and the Germans would have been clear of the blast radius. This was demolition work. Inches and seconds, life and death measured in the burn rate of detonation cord. Morris gripped his shoulder as they moved, silent acknowledgement that said more than words. Vega crossed himself, lips moving in prayer. Whitmore just stared ahead, processing the reality that an American sergeant he'd met 48 hours ago had just blown up a barn to save his life. They reached the canal at dawn. British lines, a forward observation post manned by exhausted commandos who nearly shot them before recognizing Whitmore. Hot tea, blankets, a medic who looked at Morris's leg and started swearing about field tourniquets and infection rates. McNiece sat against a sandbag wall, watching sunrise burn through the fog. His clothes were caked with mud, his hands still trembled, the ringing in his ears wouldn't stop. A British captain appeared, clipboard in hand, eyes hard. Names, unit, mission parameters. McNiece stared at him, thought about the barn, the Germans in the rubble, the Arisaka left behind, the classified briefing that would now require classified lies. Sergeant Jake McNiece, he said. No unit, no mission, just got lost in the fog. The debriefing room in the safe house outside Brussels was cold. 3 days after the barn, Morris in a field hospital, leg saved, but career probably over. Vega evacuated to London, shoulder requiring surgery. Whitmore, already reassigned, vanished into the machinery of British intelligence. And McNiece, sitting across from the same British major who'd briefed them in Antwerp, being told what the official record would say. There was no mission in Belgium, the major said, voice flat. No American advisors. No observation of German positions. You were never there. McNiece signed the papers, swore oaths, accepted the story they'd constructed, a training accident, misfiled reports, administrative confusion. The barn didn't exist. The Germans in the rubble didn't exist. The Japanese rifle definitely didn't exist. But McNiece knew the truth. The truth was the 5 seconds he'd spent frozen behind that stone wall, watching Morris bleed in the barn, calculating the odds of the fearless push and coming up with numbers that said suicide. The truth was, his hands shaking so hard he'd almost dropped the Arisaka before that first shot. The truth was, the moment of pure animal terror when he realized he was about to sprint across open ground and every instinct in his body screamed to stay down, stay safe, let someone else be the hero. He'd moved anyway, not because he was fearless, because the alternative, living with the memory of Morris dying while he did nothing, was worse than dying himself. That was the secret no citation would ever capture. The truth was also the sounds from the barn's rubble, German voices calling for help, someone trapped under timber, screaming. The wet, final silence when a beam shifted and the screaming stopped. McNiece had kept moving through the ditch, kept pushing Morris and Vega forward, but he'd heard it all, registered it all, filed it away in the part of his mind that would wake him up at 3 a.m. for the next 40 years. He'd killed men in that collapse. Not directly, not intentionally. But demolition math was unforgiving. He'd set the charges, he'd chosen the pattern. He'd known the Germans were approaching the barn's front entrance when he lit that fuse. Civilian demolition work didn't prepare you for that. Dropping bridges in Oklahoma oil fields meant calculating tons of concrete and steel. Military demolition meant calculating human lives in the blast radius and making peace with the math. McNiece had learned that in November 1940, in a Belgian barn that officially never existed. "You did well," the major said, closing his folder. "The intelligence you gathered before the incident was valuable. We'll be in touch if we need you again." McNiece nodded. Didn't mention the Arisaka. Didn't mention the way his hands still shook when he tried to light a cigarette. Didn't mention that he'd started calculating blast patterns in his sleep, running through scenarios where he'd timed the fuse differently, where maybe the Germans in the barn entrance had cleared before the collapse. He left the safe house and walked through Brussels streets, watching civilians who didn't know about classified missions or buried operations. A woman selling flowers, a man repairing a bicycle. Normal people living normal lives, while McNiece carried the memory of a barn explosion and German voices calling for help. This was the cost they never mentioned in recruitment speeches. Not the physical risk, the moral weight. The knowledge that improvisation and courage looked the same from outside, but inside your head they felt like terror and desperate calculation, and the thin hope that you'd made the right choice. Morris would recover. Vega would heal. Whitmore would disappear into the war machine, and McNiece would carry November 1940 like a stone in his chest, growing heavier each year. Years later, after D-Day and Market Garden, after the Filthy 13 became legend and his demolition work became stories told in bars and books, someone would ask him about his first real combat. McNiece would smile, deflect, tell a cleaned-up version about resourcefulness and quick thinking. He'd never mention the paralysis, the terror, the German voices in the rubble, the Arisaka left in Belgian mud. The truth that heroism and fear weren't opposites, they were the same moment, viewed from different angles, and you only knew which one you'd experienced when you were alone with your memories at 3 a.m. The first twist came in 1947, when McNiece was helping build a highway bridge in Oklahoma, and a stranger approached him at a truck stop. British accent, civilian clothes. Cold eyes McNiece had seen once before in a safe house outside Antwerp. "The barn wasn't random," the man said without preamble. "We needed to know if American personnel could execute improvised demolitions under fire with limited resources. You provided valuable data." McNiece stared at him. Morris lost his leg, eventually. Infection from that night. "War is expensive," the man said. "Your methods are now part of training doctrine. Congratulations." He left before McNiece could respond. Left him standing in an Oklahoma parking lot, understanding that November 1940 hadn't been a mission gone wrong. It had been a field test, and he'd been the lab rat. The second twist came 40 years later, at a Veterans Affairs hospital in Texas. McNiece was visiting for a routine check when he saw a familiar name on a door placard, Lieutenant Morris, physical therapy. They sat in Morris's office, two old men with damaged bodies and dangerous memories. Morris still walked with a cane. McNiece's hands still trembled when he handled anything that reminded him of detonation cord. "I never thanked you," Morris said finally, "for the push, the barn, getting us out." McNiece shook his head. "I almost didn't. Spent 5 seconds frozen behind that wall, doing math in my head. 5 seconds where you were bleeding, and I was calculating whether saving you was worth dying for. And?" The math said no. "I moved anyway." Morris smiled, tired and knowing. "That's the difference, Jake. Between people who calculate and people who move. You moved." "Yeah." McNiece looked at his hands, still strong at 70, still carrying the memory of Belgian mud and a Japanese rifle he'd never see again. "But I remember the German in the rubble, the one who stopped screaming when the beam shifted. I remember all of them." "We all do," Morris said quietly. "Every man we saved, every man we didn't, every choice that could have gone different." They sat in silence. Two survivors of a classified mission that officially never happened, carrying memories too heavy for any citation or story to hold. Years later, McNiece in his 80s, living in a small house near Fort Worth, He'd be sitting on his porch when a freight train passed on distant tracks, the rumble of wheels on steel, the deep, resonant vibration that traveled through ground and bone. And for a moment, he'd be back in Belgium. November 1940. Cold water in a drainage ditch. The sound of a barn collapsing. German voices calling for help. Morris's blood-soaked leg. Vega's whispered prayers. The weight of a Japanese rifle he'd fired 11 times and left in the mud. The legend said he'd been fearless. The citations, what few existed in buried files, said he'd shown extraordinary courage under fire. The few who knew the real story said he'd improvised a rescue that saved 3 men when the odds said all 4 should have died. But McNiece knew the truth. Knew that fearlessness was a lie we told about moments that felt like drowning in terror. Knew that courage was just fear with forward momentum. Knew that the fearless push across 30 yards of killing ground hadn't felt fearless at all. It had felt like mathematics and desperation, and the stubborn refusal to let good men die while he did nothing. The train passed. The rumble faded. McNiece returned to his porch, to his coffee, to the quiet weight of carrying history that no one would ever fully see. Some stories become legends. Some legends become lessons, but the real weight, the private cost of impossible choices made under fire, that stays with the men who lived them, heavy and patient, waiting to surface in the rumble of distant trains and the tremor of old hands that once held a rifle they barely knew how to fire. Udil, if this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.